Hi, everyone. Welcome to our monthly webinar on trending beyond COVID-19. This is Karen O'Hara. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications at WorkCare. We appreciate you joining us on this 4th of July week. I know a lot of you probably have a short week and there's vacation, so we're happy to see so many people revisiting. We miss you from month to month, so we're happy to have you here. This session is being recorded. During the webinar, you'll be on mute. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom, and I'll moderate the questions at the conclusion of the presentation. The webinar recording will be posted on our YouTube channel. A transcript of the Q&A segment will be posted on our website within a couple days. Those links to the recording and the Q&A form will be posted during the webinar. We have a full hour scheduled, so there'll be plenty of time for your questions. I know most of you are familiar with our speaker, but I'd like to introduce him to those of you who haven't had the opportunity to hear from Dr. Harris in the past. Anthony Harris, MD, MBA, MPH, is board certified in occupational medicine. He's WorkCare's Chief Innovation Officer and Associate Medical Director for on-site clinical operations. He's also our lead clinician for our COVID-19 response. So now I'll turn it over to him. Thanks for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen. And hopefully everyone can see the PowerPoint well and can hear me well. It's a pleasure to be with you once again. And we'll be talking today about shifting, obviously, beyond COVID, but in this case, from safety to wellness. And when we talk about what that means for our EHS professionals, we want to really focus in on the role that EHS has been playing during COVID and how we can leverage some of the tips, tools, techniques, strategies that have helped us survive and protect our workforce during COVID, and use and leverage those techniques and strategies for protecting our workforce at large against other threats to workplace health and well-being. And this is a deliberate, and I'll say that very unabashedly, a deliberate process that we're taking on at WorkCare to partner with our employers to help EHS professionals, safety professionals move again from their role traditionally more into a wellness phase, because it's important, as we will emphasize during this lecture and what EHS has been doing with COVID. It's important to continue to help identify those threats to productivity, absenteeism, and presenteeism, right? And so we'll talk in more depth as to how this transition may be possible and feasible based upon our experience and some of the tools that we're helping implement as we speak for our employers today. So with that, let's jump into our format that you are likely familiar with for this series, the monthly series. And that format starts with a clinical business case, why we want to entertain the clinical trends as an impact to our workers in our business. Then we'll go deep into the causal examination of what's driving this trend and try to understand so that we can prevent. And we'll share some leadership thoughts with you in terms of how we want you to think, right? Again, this series is particularly focused in on getting you to think outside the box, hence the cube on the screen here, right? And we want you to think differently about your role in the workplace and protecting the health and well-being of the workforce. We'll talk about trending as we talk about trending the pandemic, we'll look at some brief cases that will identify for us very clearly how our role may shift as we talk about shifting from safety to wellness, the mechanics behind that, as well as the messaging that we should be leading with in our workforce to communicate our strategy effectively. So with that, let's jump into the business case for today. And the business case is rooted in don't vary from your precautions. because the Delta variant is growing, okay? And this is what we want to emphasize first, and secondarily, why your enterprise obviously should not relax precautions, should hold fast to what COVID-19 has taught us, and double down on those strategies to help shift into a total worker health mentality and approach as a primary role for EHS professionals. All right. We believe this is going to become the new normal in terms of the role for EHS. It's a trend we're seeing already, and we want to make sure that we're identifying the proper pathway to help this be effective for you in the workplace. So looking at the Delta variant, we know as we've been reporting, we know that it's been present in the US for some time, for several months now, right? And we know that as we look to published articles, in this case, journal Nature, right, that the coronavirus variant is something that is a threat identified by scientists for the US, North America, as well as what we've seen play out in the United Kingdom. So we'll learn more about this threat and what it may mean for our workforce. But we know, again, these first cases of the Delta variant, we used to call it the Indian variant, right, it has played out in the UK in a dramatic way, and as in mid-April. And so we are learning from this, and we're seeing in the US it escalate in the number of cases, percentage of cases, in particular those states that are low in their immunization efforts, right? And so as we look at the impact of this, we want to examine something we reported on previously and re-examine what the impact of this Delta variant or Indian variant has done in other nations. In particular, in India, it caused a second wave of COVID-19. The hospitals were overwhelmed. We know that there was an oxygen shortage in India, and that caused a dramatic spike in their cases and mortality, right? And as we looked at the genetics of the variant, we saw that the genome was being sequenced more and more throughout the throughout India, but also began to appear in other nations in a dramatic way. And we now know, we didn't know early on back in April that it was the primary cause for the spike in India, but we now know that it is. And in particular, we reported again back in April, March, April, that it was present here in the US and 16 other countries. Now it's in over 88 countries identified, and will likely continue to trend towards becoming the more dominant variant, dominant type of COVID-19 in the world, right? And there are some, obviously we'll dig into the clinical and the science behind it, but we also wanna make sure that we're touching on what this means for your workforce and the protectionism that should be in place or may need to be reinstituted potentially as the weeks play out. We know WHO identified several variants of concern and added to those variants of concern the Delta variant. And so if you're not familiar, I wanted to, we'll share the renaming of the variants here so that everyone is level set and on the same page around the different nomenclature of the variants as it stands today. But we know in summary, the threat from these variants, particularly the Indian variant, can cause a spike, in particular when we are talking about not reaching herd immunity. We'll touch on this again in a couple minutes. When we're talking about vaccination efforts being fractionated across the US and across the world, as we look at this Indian or Delta variant, we know that it has the potential to escape immunity, either natural immunity and vaccinated immunity, the acquired immunity. And we know more evidence is coming in on a daily basis as to the protectionism of the vaccines against the Delta variant. So at the end of the day, right, we know that the goal of EHS in regards to COVID-19 has been to protect the workforce from an identified health threat, right? And so hold that in your mind. That is the nidus for what we want to expand on in regards to the role of EHS around shifting from safety to wellness, All right. And so as we continue to dig deeper into the variant and the virulence of the variant itself, how robust it is in terms of causing disease, we know the Delta variant has increased morbidity and mortality in other nations and can potentially do so in the US. If we look at the estimates historically, updated back in May of this year, of the effectiveness of the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine, this case, it was looking at healthcare professionals over this period of time, January through March 2021. We saw that it was playing out as we saw in the phase 3 clinical trials. These vaccines were quite effective. Right? In particular, the Pfizer Moderna vaccine after one dose had 82% effectiveness, after 2 doses, 94% effectiveness, right? And so that obviously that's great for protection against the wild type COVID-19, but we'll see soon that the variants identified have a different profile. So now with the relabeling or the new nomenclature for the variants, let's all make sure we're identifying the proper ones. B117, we used to call it the UK variant, is now called the Alpha variant, right? We have the Beta variant, that was the South African variant. We have Gamma variant, the P1, the Brazilian, right? And now the Delta variant, the Indian variant, right? So we want to make sure everybody's understanding when we use the nomenclature, the new nomenclature, what we're referring to in regards to the variants that have been identified and are impacting nations as well as the US. So when we look at then the reasons why clinically this variant is a threat to our health and wellness for those unvaccinated in particular, but also those who have been vaccinated potentially, it really lies in the type of mutation that this variant has. Obviously, we're not going to go into the deep details around the mutations itself, but we want to point out that the Delta variant, again, has 2 particular mutations that are novel in its construct that we have not seen before, meaning it has two mutated variants in the S protein, one that's similar to the UK mutation and one that's also similar to the South African mutation. And we see this double mutation occurring in the Delta variant. All right, and that is what is underlying its virulence or transmissibility. And we'll speak specifically about the percentage of transmissibility here shortly. And if we look at then some of the stats in regards to this virulence of the virus, this mutation, we can see that it seems to be 60% more transmissible than the Alpha variant, the B117 variant. Okay, now remember and recall the UK variant, right, the Alpha variant was already shown to be potentially 40% more transmissible than the wild type COVID-19 that we saw play out in the US, right? And we also know that the UK variant has a higher mortality rate than the wild type variant that we saw in the US, right? So keep that in mind. And now we look at then the reports on efficacy of the AstraZeneca and Pfizer vaccine in particular against COVID-19 Delta variant. And that's as low as 33%, all right, compared to 50% for the Alpha variant, the UK variant. If we look at then the protection of the Delta variant, 60% full dose, right? 60%, that's awfully low, right? And if we look at Pfizer, comparatively, it went from 80%, it went from, a comparison of the 93% against the Alpha down to 88% effectiveness. So again, we want to keep these percentages in mind because they are important to talk about overall effectiveness against protecting our workforce, protecting the population in general, and these are amongst vaccinated individuals, not to mention unvaccinated, having obviously far greater risk of transmissibility. So we visited this chart about a month ago. We looked at the states that were being opened completely. We're bringing it up again because we want to see, where potentially there may be and will likely be a resurgence. And I'm not being a doomsdayer. You guys know me well, right? But we do want to be specific about what trends are playing out. We're seeing in Florida that the fastest growing variant there obviously is the Delta variant, and they lead the nation in percentage of Delta identified infections, right? And we know other states are following close by, Mississippi and others. So as we look at trends amongst the states in regards to percentages of new cases and percentages of overall Delta variants, we're going to continue to report on this as the weeks come. All right. If we look at then the impact overall to the U.S. in terms of total number of new cases on a daily trend, right, we're not seeing a huge spike yet. All right, and so I say that to not exemplify the impact at this point in time, but only to point out that it is a potential threat to have new spikes nationwide, and we'll see whether or not that comes to fruition as it has in the UK. Now, if we're being critical, right, we know that the UK strategy in particular was a strategy of a single dose. They wanted to maximize the number of people vaccinated with at least one dose of the primarily AstraZeneca vaccine as well as the Pfizer vaccine, right? And so that strategy, unfortunately, it has come back to for lack of a better way of putting it, haunt the UK, okay, because of the limited effectiveness of a single dose against the Delta variant. And if we look at then overall the daily trend of deaths in the US, we're not seeing a spike there. Remembering that deaths are a lagging indicator based upon number of infections that we're seeing across the board. So let's look specifically now at the UK. This is up to date as of today, July 6th, yesterday, what has happened in the UK, right? We've seen all the reports, but there's been a dramatic spike in cases in the UK. This too may play out in the United States. Again, we have a 2-dose or fully dosed strategy, which helps us, but we have to look at the numbers of percentage of people who have been vaccinated completely or at least receiving one dose to try to derive the impact from this Delta variant and understand, do we simplify our process at work in terms of protection with COVID to a dual strategy, or do we stick with a single strategy, meaning everybody still needs to honor precautions because of this new potential threat? So let's look at the average daily prevalence of the Delta variant in the US and worldwide, right? So let's look real quick at worldwide. We're seeing that the percentage of this variant compared to, on a 7-day rolling average, compared to other variants has dramatically increased, right? So now we know that this is the most prevalent variant at this point in time, and not just in India, not just in, you guys are seeing it play out in other parts of Asia, but worldwide. And if we look specifically where we stand in the US, this is a list of prevalence identified in various nations. And we can see where the UK stands here, roughly at 20% prevalence of the Delta variant in the United Kingdom, underlying likely that spike that we just showed on the previous chart. Okay, and if we look at where the U.S. stands, we're far further down the list. Again, we're in that range of about 1 to 5%. So we're not close to the UK in terms of makeup of the Delta variant here yet. But if we see the percentage continue to grow, we can anticipate the number of cases likewise are going to grow, again, potentially in those states that have very low vaccination rates comparatively. So let's revisit again the reality of where we are in regards to herd immunity, because again, this is going to impact our overall strategy and potential to either ease restrictions down the road, or we'll kind of seal our fate in regards to having to keep precautions in place for some time to come. Now, we presented the five reasons why COVID herd immunity was probably impossible to reach, right? We won't go through all five again today, but we want to iterate that there are a number of scientifically undergirded reasons estimated that we're not going to reach the threshold of 60 to 70% immunity that is necessary to gain herd immunity, right? And again, this is just talking U.S. strategy. Global herd immunity still is something that's even further unattainable in regards to overall percentages. And that, again, is the dynamic that will continue to cause a potential threat to the U.S. and limit our ability to ease restrictions without increased potential risk from other mutations that will occur inevitably from genetic drift and genetic shifts in the COVID-19 virus. All right, so as we look at then an update of where we stand in the U.S. with regard to vaccinations and trying to reach some level of herd immunity, we're still at 55% receiving at least one dose and 47% fully vaccinated. So again, we're still woefully under the necessary 60% fully vaccinated at the bottom of the estimate for herd immunity, and obviously further from the 70% estimate for attaining herd immunity. And again, we're talking this, speaking to this amongst adults, and we're just now entering phases of having younger children being vaccinated. So we'll see if these numbers move a bit for us over the summer, but again, unlikely to reach those levels that will keep all of us safe in regards to herd immunity. So what do we think about this, right? What are some of the thought leadership concepts that we need to have in place that's going to carry us through the rest of this COVID pandemic that's still at the forefront of our strategy to help protect our workforce? And can we learn from these strategies a methodology to help protect our workforce against other potential threats to health and well-being? The answer for us is yes, and that's what we want to share with you in terms of shifting from safety to wellness. What are some of the ideas that we can carry forward to get us closer to that ideal of total worker health in our efforts, right? That nomenclature is not new, total worker health, right? NIH coined that terminology some time ago, several years ago, and we want to utilize that concept and apply some practical tools. We won't go through all the tools today, but we want to introduce at least the thought and the process by which we can leverage COVID techniques to help protect our workforce in perpetuity in regards to things we've learned practically. So if we take a step back and we look at then again our potential to get on the other side of this pandemic, right? And the dismal picture I want to paint again is that in regards to what we should be able to reach, or excuse me, what we need to reach, the 71%, 72% based upon responses for people who were interested in vaccination. Let's say all of those people who were surveyed get vaccinated, all right? With the protection factor of the vaccine against the variants, we're still only at a derived herd immunity or a derived immunity in the US of 37.5 up to 50% in aggregate, okay? So again, that is a very low percentage and far from the protective level for preventing transmissions. And again, that's painting the picture of why we're going to have to continue these strategies for some time to come. If we look at then transitioning our thought process of COVID as an identified threat to health and well-being and a primary role of EHS during this COVID pandemic, we want to start to look at then overall excess mortality in regards to all causes of death, right? Not just COVID-19, but we want to compare to COVID-19 because it's clear And it's, that we've played a role, our EHS folk have played a role, and a very important role, and been successful in so many cases of protecting our workforce from workplace transmission. And so now we want to identify how can we look at other health outcomes that are important for us to pay attention to, and again, develop strategy and tools to help us protect our workforce from them. So let's quickly glance at all causes of mortality and excess deaths. We talked about excess deaths months ago when we were doing our weekly webinar, right? And we're revisiting for the first time in this format so that we can clearly see out of all of 2020, there was obviously excess death caused by COVID-19. In this particular chart, we're seeing the all causes excluding COVID-19 in the dark color and all causes in the lighter color. Okay, and you can see the delta between those that is attributed to COVID-19 causing excess deaths between these months of measurement, right? And if we look at then a further breakdown of this statistic, we can see the number of excess deaths with the dark and the black at the bottom being the total number above the upper bound of threshold, excluding COVID-19, and then all causes excluding 19, and followed by the next layer there, total number above the upper bound threshold of all causes, and finally the total number above average, right? And so it's clear in terms of the delineation that COVID-19 has had on excess deaths, right? But again, it also begs the question, these other causes of mortality, what are they? And can we do something about them in terms of protecting our workforce and not just limited to a role for COVID-19 protectionism? So let's get into that, right? So let's examine. So if we look at the causation of death up to 2020, this is 2015 through 2020, right? Published by the CDC, we can look at then total deaths and start to break down these causes. COVID-19, as we reported some time ago, being the third cause of death. But above COVID-19, we have cancer, we have heart disease, right? If we jump down to other roles that EHS has played on this list, it's obviously, particularly with COVID, flu vaccine campaigns, right? And influenza being on the list of top causes of death. And so I want to paint the picture very clearly. We play a role, EHS, right, in parts of well-being, right, health and wellness and well-being, identified and protecting workers. But thus far, it has been really heavy on preventing workplace transmission infections, as well as community infections, right? Influenza and pneumonia, and now COVID-19. So we want to hold in mind that we can have an impact to help prevent other causes of mortality and morbidity in the workplace that obviously impact our workforce. And so what can that potentially look like for us? Getting into that right now, we can look at techniques and tools for total worker health in a similar frame that we have for COVID surveillance, right? And if we look at what we've done with COVID surveillance, we started out with our primary, our secondary, and our tertiary levels of prevention, right? And that's what will help us, again, in perpetuity, protect our workforce in regards to other endpoints of health and well-being. So if we double down on our strategy for COVID-19 and our preventative strategy, we are looking at workplace safety, and we can layer in then the three levels of protection or three levels of preventative interventions, right? And with SARS-CoV-2, we knew that it would remain a threat. We knew that we were going to continue to have to provide some level of workplace intervention. We've seen what OSHA has recommended in California to protect workers that are vulnerable. We see that for our second layer, that genetic changes are going to continue to cause a threat in the workplace. And we see that on a preventative strategy, from a tertiary preventative strategy, it's going to be necessary to be competitive in our workplace, right, in terms of our overall productivity of our workforce. And so if we kind of parse this out into a continuum, This is how we've examined and prepared ourselves and executed on our COVID-19 protectionism. We looked at transmission prevention, right? And we looked at absenteeism in a way, and that's the shift that we want to continue to move towards in regards to safety to wellness, right? Prevention of a health threat, and at the end of the day, preventing our workforce from experiencing absenteeism, presenteeism, lost productivity, right? And as we move in this continuum, we look at preventing incidents or examining the incidents and performing surveillance to identify health threats, right? And then offering in the workplace so the level of not just observation and understanding of the impact, but start to introduce interventions, right? And those interventions carry out beyond the workplace into the community. That's obviously been true with COVID-19 and will be true for other health endpoints that we want to help impact, right? And when we looked at COVID-19 from an absenteeism standpoint, we put in place return to work strategy, provided solutions for families in regards to is the family impacted and how does that impact the employee, as well as sequelae. We talked about brain fog and persistent health effects cardiovascular-wise of COVID-19. And finally, fitness for duty, meaning that we had a strategy for understanding who was impacted by COVID-19 in a way that affected their ability to perform their job in a safe fashion, right? And so this is the continuum that we want to move forward from a strategy standpoint to help impact other health outcomes that keep our workforce out of work and cause obviously more mortality in our communities. So when we talk about going beyond infection, right, that's the message that we want to double down on to our workforce, right? Because so far it's been COVID, some flu, right? But we also want to say, look, as an EHS professional, we're going to move forward with strategy and techniques and tools to help you stay healthy beyond COVID. And that's how we win at the end of the day. And so when we talk about absenteeism in the workplace, right, we know that it's not just illness, it's not just other causes that prevent us in our workforce from showing up to work. We know that illness and injury, sometimes unavoidable, are a prominent feature of that. And if you look at a number of surveys and lists that are looking at the workforce, we know illness and injury are at the top of the list, right? And so we can obviously impact this with some tools that help us move beyond COVID. And an example of that, we won't again digest fully in the interest of time some of the additional services that and solutions that we're entertaining and bringing to bear. But we want to give an example, right, of our technique that we leveraged in COVID, particularly the daily screening. And if you recall, we've been daily screening since March of last year, those individuals who are potentially at risk to stay home and stay safe. Right. And so likewise, on a daily basis, we can then leverage that level of engagement with employees to help identify other risk areas. All right. And so we're seeing a trend, particularly behind two areas right now: musculoskeletal health and mental health. OK, and these health outcomes obviously are impacting in a phenomenal way, have been impacting in a phenomenal way, but have increased during COVID. We've reported, several weeks ago or several months ago on the threefold increase in mental health as a result of COVID-19. What we're also seeing in the trend is increased musculoskeletal injuries because the workforce, right, and in often cases, it has been those entities that have been in production, the food services industry, as well as some of the heavy industry, have been running full tilt, 12-hour days, mandated overtime, and we're seeing upticks in cumulative traumas, musculoskeletal injuries, right? And so we have to be able to carry forward our new strategies that we have learned from COVID-19 to help impact these areas. So let's examine one of those. In this case, we'll examine mental health. And one of the tools we are implementing is a mental health triage program. We may have touched on this some time ago, but we're revisiting it because, again, it's a strategy that comes right from the pages of our COVID-19 surveillance. And so our COVID-19 surveillance, as with this mental health triage, is built on the concept of ecological momentary assessment, EMA. EMA is a science rooted back in the 70s from psychiatry. And what EMA has taught us, ecological momentary assessment, is that if we query individuals in the moment throughout their day, we get robust data or information on what they're experiencing or what their behavior is, far better than just isolated questionnaires or isolated queries at intervals in time, meaning instead of doing one survey a year or maybe two for a wellness program where you spend 20 minutes or maybe even 2 hours filling it out, break that down into a daily screening process or a daily questionnaire process that takes you only 1 to 2 minutes to complete. And we're leveraging this on a digital format, same digital front door that COVID leverages, and we're able to capture robust information that helps us identify who may be at risk, in this case for mental health, right? And this information, again, is not utilized back to the HR or back to the employer necessarily in terms of individual identification, but it's utilized to then provide to the employee a roadmap for perhaps self-care, right, or mindfulness training, and provide interventions that can go from, that first layer, which is self-care, all the way to a clinical intervention if necessary. And so, again, the goal being, let's identify risk, let's offer interventions that help prevent absenteeism, presenteeism, and other health outcomes that we know play a role in minimizing the productivity of our workforce. And it's not to say this is going to supplant our, not necessarily wellness programs of old, but supplant, our insurance programs that are in place, right? This is only supplementary to that, and it's information that we've broken down and distilled in a way in which EHS professionals are best suited to digest this information. We'll talk more about that during our next session here and how we have captured both subjective information in this daily format, right, and paired that with objective data around risk, right? Because our EHS, what we know is that our EHS professionals are really expertise, and their experience has been to capture data like noise sampling for hearing conservation, turn that objective data into risk for the individual and provide interventions. So too are we doing that with other health outcomes. Subjective information from that EMA philosophy, right, ecological momentary assessment, paired with objective data around these health outcomes so that we can provide the best risk stratification and the appropriate interventions, tools for the EHS professionals to offer to their workforce. So with that, we're gonna hit the pause button. It's about 40 minutes into the presentation, enough time to get through some questions. I know you have tons of COVID questions coming my way, so let's end here and jump into those questions for you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Harris, and we will jump right into the questions. Could you elaborate on the general recommendations for workforces that are 100% vaccinated? The assumption is that there will be greater freedom in those types of settings due to high vaccination percentage. What are the concerns that we should have with regard to a fully vaccinated workforce? And then subsequent to that, could you elaborate on if it's a mixed population, we don't really know for sure who all is vaccinated or not vaccinated. What's the difference between the two populations?
Absolutely. So the answer to this question is a percentage-based response, meaning that it is definitely incumbent on EHS to keep in place precautions when a threshold of vaccination in the workplace is below necessary levels to protect the workforce. Now, is that level 60%? Is that level 70%, or even 80% in some cases? The simple answer, if we want to oversimplify that answer, is roughly 70%, right? If you reach a threshold of 70% in most jurisdictions in the US, that has been widely accepted internally here at amongst our clinicians at WorkCare, as well as in other clinical bodies, as a number to move forward with easing precautions, because you have a relative herd immunity in that population in the workplace, right? We've talked about this, I believe, 1 or 2 months ago in this venue. Now, if you're below that threshold and you have a mixed population, precautions should be in place, and we recommend keeping precautions in place for all workers, unless you're in a scenario in which you're able to identify specifically and validate those workers who have been vaccinated. We know that trend is playing out amongst some employers that allow their employees to sign an attestation that they've been vaccinated. And that attestation serves as a grounds for, if they are prevaricating, lying, right, there are consequences from an HR standpoint. So we recommend, again, mixed population below the threshold necessary to protect the workforce, keep precautions in place, unless specifically identified individuals have been validated for their vaccination status, and they can enjoy some additional freedoms, as we see, again, employers doing. Now, if you're 100% vaccinated, obviously you're far above the threshold necessary to protect the workforce, and removing precautions in that place would be reasonable. And that, again, is not just Dr. Harris speaking, but a consensus amongst WorkCare clinicians, as well as what we've pulled from other clinical bodies as well.
Could you quickly just go over the precautions? For example, wearing masks, social distancing,
Sure. So,
to refresh everyone's memory.
absolutely. So the precautions start with those that continuum we talked about, right? So keeping in place the symptomatic screening, right? And it's plus or minus the temperature checks at this point in time. We know some employers have permanent fixed infrared cameras in place that will, from now until, screen workers for fever. We think that's a great idea if it's, from a business standpoint, feasible, because again, you're helping screen symptomatic individuals, not just for COVID, but for other potential causes of workplace transmission. Recognizing again the statistic that 94%, which we reported on again a month ago, 94% of individuals in the workplace admit to coming to work sick. And so helping prevent transmissions of not just COVID, but other transmissible illness is important. And that's why some of those permanent features will persist. And then the second layer of protection is the social distancing and the wearing of masks. Hand hygiene still plays a significant role in that, as well as it does to help prevent workplace transmission of other illnesses, as we've seen. So those are the basics. Now we can get to the particulars of should you be cleaning surfaces still and things of that nature. Again, we won't revisit those precautions because we've identified that the surfaces aren't as much of a risk as we once believed there were, but those precautions I just mentioned previously should be in place still if your workforce is vulnerable. Now, there's still a considerable amount of effort that needs to be considered, particularly like if we mentioned Cal-OSHA and the requirement for employers to have a identification process for vaccinated individuals if they want to ease their precautions, right? But also inherent in OSHA recommendations is the requirement to protect those vulnerable individuals. And so when we talk about what's required to protect individuals, we're now getting into reasonable accommodations. So that's a case-by-case basis, depending on what the underlying medical condition is for someone who is potentially at risk, increased risk for COVID-19 transmission and poor outcomes. So your clinicians or your corporate medical directors will still need to be involved, very likely, in that process on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful because a lot of people were asking about those specific recommendations. This person is the very first to ask a question, so we have to be sure we get to her question. Have there been any updates from OSHA's temporary guidelines with regard to safely performing pulmonary function tests / spirometry?
Not yet, as I've seen. We do have some clinical clinicians starting to perform PFTs again, but I have not seen anything deterministic around going back to how things were previously. We know that in the health care industry, there's still a requirement to wear masks and precautions regardless of vaccination status, right? So those type of precautions are still in place, and we're still waiting for additional updates. I anticipate that we won't see anything new in that regard until we see more of how reopening with the Delta variant increasing in percentage plays out here in the U.S.
We'll have to keep an eye. We keep an eye on OSHA. They don't move at the speed of light, so you never know. You might come up with something. Is the effectiveness of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine similar to the AstraZeneca vaccine with respect to the Delta variant?
No, we know that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is not as effective against COVID-19 in general compared to Pfizer and Moderna. So when we talk about the Delta variant, there is one report that I have reviewed that demonstrated there is some efficacy for Johnson & Johnson, but it is significantly lower compared to Pfizer and Moderna. I'll have to dig that one back up to give you the specific percentage, but it is, as I recall, lower than what we see with the other vaccines.
Okay. What is the current nationwide percentage of COVID-19 breakthrough cases for individuals who have been previously vaccinated?
Good question. There's still not great data on breakthrough infections. We talked about reinfection, right? I believe it was last month or the month prior to, and we knew that at the time, reinfections were underestimated, woefully underestimated. Why? Because individuals who were vaccinated were getting, not necessarily getting tested because it was presumed that it was not COVID-19 or something, some other type of illness, and the symptomatology being more succinct than a wild type infection with an unvaccinated individual. So looking at an update of that statistic is something that would be germane to our next presentation as well. So I will add that statistic to the list to report on a follow-up presentation.
Another question about vaccinated employees. Should we keep a vaccinated employee who tests positive for COVID but doesn't have symptoms out of work?
Simple answer is yes, because there's still not enough data around can that individual shed viral particles and cause infection as well. So yes, that individual vaccinated who tests positive should be kept out of work. Now, with that being said, it's a question of, I think it was in the question, correct me if I'm wrong, did the question reference symptomatic versus asymptomatic?
Asymptomatic.
Okay. Got it. And so, yeah, the reasonable precaution should be taken for even an asymptomatic individual testing positive for COVID for a period of time. Now, it's not in perpetuity, obviously, but it's the same approach that we had of old in regards to an asymptomatic COVID positive individual. After 10 days of that positive test, that individual is likely not to be infectious any longer. Now, that period of time may be shorter for a vaccinated individual, but still, because the vaccine is not 100%, we know that people will still be able to contract and transmit COVID after vaccination, and thus an individual positive should be in the same bucket for the most part as those who test positive otherwise.
Okay, that kind of corresponds with this next question. We just have a couple questions remaining. First, a comment. There seems to be many studies on fully vaccinated individuals and their length of immunity. And we are seeing our COVID hotline now with employees who have been fully vaccinated over 8 months ago, showing COVID plus. Are there studies looking at the COVID recovered immunity and the length of time they are immune?
Just one clarification, you referenced or read COVID plus, is that meaning?
COVID positive.
COVID positive, okay, got it,
Yes.
got it. Perfect, yeah, so the prevailing wisdom on immunity is, obviously, we came up with 6 months some time ago. 8 months was, there is data showing 8 months of memory B cells still persistent and able to have a great immune response to a COVID-19 challenge. And thus far, the clinical studies that are looking at the booster, particularly around the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, is suggesting that there is immunity that lasts for at least 12 months. One study in particular looked at the bone marrow of individuals who had recovered from COVID-19 and showed long-lasting immunity 12 months out from titers. So we will see, obviously, cases of COVID-19 after a period of time because we know immunity does wane, but it appears to be, in general, longer than we initially thought. And for those individuals who are vaccinated, it may be as long as 12 months.
Okay, here's another great question. I'm not aware of any studies showing vaccines reduce or prevent transmission of COVID, only potentially reducing the severity of illness. And we also know hospitalizations and deaths. Taking this into consideration, why would there be different rules for the vaccinated versus the unvaccinated in the workplace?
Sure, and that is true, right? The claims that the vaccine prevents transmissions is not a claim that is made by the pharmaceuticals, right? It's not a claim that's supported by FDA. However, what we have seen play out is that a vaccinated population, even the population that has contracted and recovered from COVID-19, are less susceptible to infection, right? And as a result of a minimization of susceptibility following that, transmission is also decreased. So again, the leap to decreased transmission in terms of claim is not made. However, we've seen, again, less susceptibility, particularly, we've seen less symptomatic disease, and we'll continue to likely see lessened transmission albeit if the Delta variant is really a big factor in our transmission rates and whether or not they'll spike. Hope that answers the question there, and I can clarify further if need be, Karen.
Okay, great. I think you answered it. So we have a couple more questions and 5 minutes remaining. The CDC stopped tracking positive cases in those vaccinated on May 7th. why wouldn't we want to track this information? It seems very insightful for efficacy of vaccines.
Sure. So in terms of overall tracking and positives, in vaccinated individuals, again, it's going back to individuals who are vaccinated, not testing as relative to those individuals who had not been vaccinated previously. So because of the paucity of data, even before CDC stopped tracking, it would be a reason why it's not robust enough to be reliable. Now, one particular metric that would be interesting to look at instead of tracking those who are positive would be looking at, again, seropositivity of populations amongst the vaccinated individuals, right? That would give us data to help us understand who has continuance of immunity in the vaccinated population, which would be more meaningful for us in terms of long-term strategy for protecting our workforce. So I'm just throwing it out there that it would be useful to look at some metrics in regard to those vaccinated individuals. I think the seropositivity would be better metric than the individuals who are being tested after, for whatever reason, after being vaccinated.
Okay. Final question. What are your thoughts on the World Health Organization stating that vaccinated people should continue to wear masks versus the CDC's recommendations on mask wearing in the United States?
Sure. The WHO has, as they've been since the beginning of the pandemic, spoken to the broader world population, right? And if we look at total population of vaccinated individuals broadly in the world, it's dramatically low, dismally low, right? And because of that, it is, as the US was, right, in the beginning of our vaccination efforts, CDC was recommending, vaccinated or not, continue to wear a mask. Only recently, in the past weeks, as we know, CDC said, as we reported on in our previous webinar, CDC gave the recommendations that vaccinated individuals do not need to wear masks. That's only because of the tremendous effort and percentages that we have attained for fully vaccinated folks. So again, with the world being in general dismal at vaccination efforts, it is prudent to continue to have a WHO stance consistent with where the US was. And I anticipate one day, probably a year or two from now, WHO, if our vaccination efforts globally are at the par of where the US has been, will make the same shift to vaccinated folks not needing to wear a mask.
Okay, we're out of time, so we have to conclude the session. Again, thank you all for joining us. We'll see you back here on August 4th. We'll look forward to seeing you then. Thank you, Dr. Harris, as always, for your insights. We really appreciate it. Everybody stay safe and enjoy the summer.
Thanks so much, and God bless.